It's an open secret that the military is struggling to find recruits. Gen Z is far less interested in the service than any previous generations have been. In 2022, the Army fell 15,000 recruits short of its goal, and for the past 2 years have failed to meet these goals by 10,000 soldiers. Meanwhile, the US government continues to shed hundreds of millions of dollars each year to advertise to the youth of today, only to no avail. And as if recruitment wasn't low enough, nearly a third of the soldiers who join leave before fulfilling their initial commitment to the service. Simply put, young people today, and people in general, don't much like the armed forces. Perhaps it was the useless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Perhaps it was the war crimes we committed along the way. Or perhaps it's young people are more aware of the perils of war than they've ever been and don't want to fight in them. But just as it has always been, every war that is fought has to be sold, and these days it's getting increasingly more difficult for the government to sell anything to us, leading them to shift towards increasingly extreme and bizarre recruiting tactics.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
Hey, this video is sponsored by me. Do you like me? Do you want to see more of the videos? Then consider pressing that like button and subscribing to the channel. It's free, doesn't cost you anything, and it really helps me to be able to keep making content. Back to the video. The year was 1941, and director Frank Capra was on top of the world. Off of the back of box office smashes like It Happened One Night in 1934, You Can't Take It With You in 1938, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, 1939. Capra had quickly established himself as the preeminent filmmaker of Hollywood's emerging golden age. But coinciding with his and the industry's meteoric rise was the beginning of the Second World War, and soon America's involvement in it. On December 7th, 1941, Japan's troops carried out a surprise attack on the US's base in Pearl Harbor, bringing the deaths of over 2,000 Americans and many more in the coming war. But the unforeseen strike also sparked one of the most unifying sentiments among the American people, with a Gallup poll indicating that prior to the attack, only half believed a conflict with the Axis was inevitable, but following the bombing, reports showed that an overwhelming 97% were in support of entering the war. But the sudden thrusting of America right into World War II proved tricky, as the country and its peacetime army had to instantly pick up the fight before they would usually be prepared or certain for the war ahead. Many of the soldiers who were supposed to readily and willingly fight and die for America were unsure of what they were to fight and to fight for. Japan's attack had left no doubt that a war needed to be fought, but for what was something that the American public hadn't spent the last few years of the war thinking about, because frankly, most of them weren't in it. And this was the problem that stared down General George C. Marshall, who, knowing that the soldiers required a deeper meaning instilled in the war effort, devised a series of orientation films for all Army troops before they traveled overseas. The movies he envisioned were intended to replace the previous method of verbal lectures on morality delivered by Army officers to the other soldiers, a strategy that Marshall deemed baffling, bewildering, or just boring. In early 1942, the Army recruited Frank Capra to direct the films and saddled him with the job of, quote, maintaining morale and instilling loyalty and discipline into the civilian army, through the series of propaganda movies they tasked him with making. Thus, Capra re-entered the military, having been newly commissioned as an Army Signal Corps major, and charged with creating these films by the US War Department. And by the end of his service, Capra left the military with the rank of colonel and 7 hours worth of a documentary series entitled Why We Fight. The movies themselves were relatively short by Hollywood standards, with the bulk of the runtime deriving from the fact that the collection consisted of 7 films in total. These documentaries laid out the course of the war in detail, to illustrate the origins of the conflict and the stakes if America didn't fight against it. But as it framed its clear narrative, it glossed over some significant but inconvenient truths about the US's allies. Namely, the series neglected to ever mention the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was an agreement signed by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union shortly before the war broke out, promising neither side would take military action against each other for the next decade. See, with Europe teetering on the brink of another big war, Stalin viewed the pact as something that could keep them on good terms with Germany, giving the Soviets time to build up their military. Hitler, on the other hand, favored it as a way to ensure his invasion of Poland would go unopposed, knowing that extending Germany's borders into Poland would leave the Nazis' territory backed right up to the edges of the Soviet Union, something Stalin wouldn't stand for. Within 2 years after signing it, though, Hitler tore it up and began Operation Barbarossa, sending an army of 3 million on an ill-fated mission to invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941. Although Marshall had originally ordered the production of these films for only the army to use them as instructional material, the US government realized what fine propaganda they had and decided to bankroll a release to the broader American public. The films trickled out into the silver screen of regular citizens between 1942 and 45, and by the official end of World War II, more than 54 million Americans had seen the series in full, and Capra had been awarded the Distinguished Service Medal by the U.S. Army for the success of the documentaries. To this day, despite its propagandized narrative, most critics and historians regard the Why We Fight films as some of the finest documentaries of World War II. From around the end of World War II and into the early 90s, the US and Soviets fought an ideological war, much of which was a stalemate due to the pervading threats of nuclear attacks. The war between the growing fad of communism and the forces pushing against it spread over multiple continents and decades, but wasn't particularly violent, as the conflict never quite heated up into actual battles, leading to it being called the Cold War. And the Cold War wasn't concerned as much with acquiring territory, even though battles were waged to sway some nations one way or the other, but instead focused on shaping global beliefs around the rising interest in communism. This ideological split between communism and its detractors was termed the Iron Curtain by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and did cause some visible shifts and divisions in Europe, especially in Germany with the beginning of the Berlin Wall's construction in 1961, splitting Germany into East and West. And one of the biggest political justifications for America's actions in the actual wars that occurred in the Cold War and later Vietnam was the domino theory. In modern day, the domino theory has largely been debunked, and we'll get to why soon, but its premise suggested that a standing communist government of one nation would quickly cause neighboring countries to fall to communist regimes. The idea's origins in the late 40s spurred then-President Truman to give aid to Greece and Turkey to assist their fight to contain communism in Europe and the Middle East. So the Cold War had easily been sold to the on-the-ground soldiers and leaders under a seemingly solid, albeit erroneous, theory, but the public still wasn't convinced. This would soon change in 1950 when Senator Joseph McCarthy launched what's now known as the Red Scare. The American propaganda of this era would begin with Senator McCarthy's very public assertion that communism had seeped into the highest echelons of government. During a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, honoring Lincoln's birthday, he announced to the crowd that communists had infiltrated the U.S. government and emphatically held up a list of 205 known communists who were working in the State Department. His proclamation sent the American public into a frenzy within just a few days, even though the paper was later revealed to be blank. McCarthyism rapidly spread, extending the gripping hold that it had over the United States and ushering in one of the most controversial periods in U.S. history. This era of Red Panic bled into almost all spheres of American life, bringing the constant, unavoidable fear that everyone around you and above you could secretly be a communist. But the U.S. wasn't the only country to push some propaganda. The USSR also spun tales of the evil capitalist West, being warmongering and hostile, warning of the dangers of imminent imperialist intervention into the socialist countries. And the American response to this wasn't any less one-sided, with them leading into a similarly embellished us versus them story. The FBI, under J. Hoover, took to the public stage to warn Americans that not only do communists live among them, they should take action against anyone they believe to be a hidden commie. When it came to the domestic spread of propaganda, the Soviets owned all the public radios and political organizations that distributed news throughout the country, along with the Communist Party having total control of the print media. In an effort to combat this, the U.S. formed Radio Free Europe in 1950, a government-funded broadcasting organization that distributed news and information to communist countries, where the flow of free speech was stifled. This publicizing of anti-Soviet propaganda in communist Eastern European countries prompted plenty of protests and movement in response, including the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. And on top of this, the propaganda war made its way into film as well. Within Hollywood movies from the late 40s to 1950s, the American film industry played into the commie behind every corner paranoia by throwing out conspiracies with 1949's Red Menace and I Married a Communist the same year.
If you call the police, your husband will be arrested for murder.
Even some horror and sci-fi movies inserted the fear of a communist takeover into their storylines, as in 1954's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1962's Red Nightmare, though initially made as an instructional film for the armed forces, once again saw a public release, with a plotline centered around the absurd claim that Soviets had reconstructed entire U.S. cities to train their communist spies to take down the American society and its government. On the other side of the war, in the USSR, their government likewise produced propagandized films criticizing capitalism. The Soviets' answer to I Married a Communist was the 1948 film The Russian Question, which followed an American reporter journeying to Moscow only to discover the Soviet leaders aren't actually evil, and is attacked by the press when he returns home to tell of what he's found out. Overall, this period and prior eras sold its wars primarily on the vehicle of fear, which was clearly effective in convincing people to support and fight for the American stakes. Unfortunately, for the sake of the propaganda, the government was slowly losing control over the media its public got to consume. Going into the Vietnam War, the reasons for justifying the American involvement in the conflict became increasingly flimsy in the eyes of the people. To defend the U.S.'s presence in Vietnam, the Eisenhower administration revived the domino theory a decade later after it was used to support their interests during the Cold War, to keep other Southeast Asian countries from falling to communism. And after the presidency transferred from Eisenhower over to Kennedy, the government increased its commitment of the U.S.'s resources to South Korea and anti-communist forces in the Lao Civil War of the time. Then, following JFK's 1963 assassination, his successor Lyndon B. Johnson continued to lead the Army under the principles of the domino theory. In the coming years, the theory also became the impetus for escalating the military presence in Vietnam from a few thousand soldiers to 500,000 over the next 5 years. In modern day, the domino theory has almost entirely been discredited, given that, spoiler alert, the Vietnam War ended with America failing to keep the country from being overtaken by communism. Unsurprisingly, since the ideology of surrounding countries aren't dependent on the weather, no other nations followed, proving the unquestioned fallacy of the thought that countries fall to each other like dominoes, when historically they tend not to. From 1950 to 1966, the percentage of American households with a television jumped from 9% to 93%, with the rise of technology in full bloom. And as everyone began to watch TV, the news networks had to compete with one another to have more eyes on them, leading to the most excitement, best reporters, and peak drama becoming necessary to attract an audience. In order for networks to succeed and draw in the largest number of viewers, increasingly interesting boundary-pushing elements had to be added to keep people glued to them. And what would be more interesting than one of the grisliest on-site television firsts? During World War II, television broadcasts were not exactly entirely government-run, but the state had a larger role to play in their production. If the press wanted access to stories about the ongoing war, they had to get their credentials to do so from the military. Obviously, this opened the door for the news having to neglect telling certain stories that the military didn't want to get out. News coverage of the battles stayed away from combat zones and presented stories with cheery dispositions to theaters of people, tossing aside stories of the A-bomb while the war was happening in favor of sharing only the good news. But by the time Vietnam rolled around, these regulations were slowly becoming more relaxed, and reporters, in turn, were becoming more adventurous and risky with their coverage because that drew people in. All of this culminated in the news of Vietnam being far bleaker than broadcasted war stories had ever been. And the on-site coverage that the war received disturbed a lot of Americans who might not have been as acquainted with the brutal violence of the wars that were being fought overseas on their behalf. Camera crews were now getting into combat zones for their stories, and journalists were recording the day-to-days of the battles from the field. Expanding the breadth of the coverage like this gave Americans a more realistic peek into the lives of their own country's soldiers, allowing the death and violence to pull on their heartstrings more than just hearing about death tolls ever could. And most people, who were already becoming more skeptical of why exactly we were in Vietnam to begin with, were deeply disturbed and outraged by what they saw. With the public seeing the defeat the U.S. suffered with the Tet Offensive in 1968 and the My Lai Massacre the same year, the perils of the battlefield never seemed more visceral and real than they did now. This growing anti-war sentiment sparked several riots in cities and university campuses across the nation, and this outrage mostly fueled the decision to withdraw the U.S. troops from Vietnam in 1973. Ending America's part in the war. And regardless of any political motivations that may have driven the war's detractors to protest, most of the strength of the movement likely came from many regular Americans seeing people getting blown to bits on their television and getting mad.
As I sat in my office last evening waiting to speak, I thought of the many times each week when television brings the war into the American home. No one can say exactly what effect those vivid scenes have on American opinion. Historians must only guess at the effect that television would have had during earlier conflicts on the future of this nation.
As the war in Vietnam and all of the associated controversy raged on, the US military faced a burgeoning problem with recruiting. Due to protests and a lot of people's outrage, the men who were willing to enlist and serve were running low. In response to their forces quickly depleting, the Department of Defense launched a new initiative to fix the issue, Project 100,000. Project 100,000 was aimed at bringing in significantly more soldiers by drastically lowering the existing recruiting standards. And as to be expected when they chose to let in individuals who had been previously denied because of their failure to meet medical or military standards, this program became quite controversial. See, even with the need for more fighting men becoming desperate, President Johnson didn't want to start drafting students in college. Instead, he and his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, spent 2 years attempting to convince Congress and the Pentagon that they should allow some changes to be made to the requirements for passing the enlistment aptitude test. By 1966, it became clear that the military was in dire straits with recruiting numbers, leading them to relent to the plan. Then, in August of that year, McNamara unveiled his plan for Project 100,000 to the veterans of foreign wars, and described it as a way to recruit draft rejects. And in order to sell the project, it was also tied in with Johnson's war on poverty, so McNamara could fly the plan under the flag of helping the struggling Americans living below the poverty line. 3 months later, Project 100,000 was launched alongside the decision to lower the required score on the enlistment aptitude test, 6%. Such changes were not new to the military, though. In World War II, similar initiatives softened the standards to let in those who had scored in lower percentiles, but still maintained the mandatory IQ of 80 for enlistment, in contrast to Project 100,000. As the project rolled out, recruits underwent some basic training, though few received the additional video instruction the initiative promised, since those training videos were supposed to make up for the recruits' often lacking education. In fact, Project 100,000 didn't make good on many of its promises, as nearly half of the recruits who joined were sent into combat roles, even though the military assured everyone otherwise. Essentially, the military was enabling itself to use rejects as cannon fodder. But maybe they did mislead people about their intentions with Project 100,000 recruits, but guys, they're just giving the poor draft rejects a chance to serve their country. And if the military complex and its soldiers did view the initiative that way, as they proclaimed they did by classifying these new recruits as new standards men, it might not be that reprehensible, but they didn't. Allegations surfaced that the soldiers were giving them the nickname the Moron Corps, and Johnson himself was privately referring to them as second-class fellows. I'm sure that's just the tip of the iceberg, too. They were called forwards, I imagine. During this period, it's been estimated that 5,500 of these members died while serving, a fatality rate triple that of other soldiers. Additionally, 20,270 were wounded, and 500 reportedly had injuries so great they required amputations. Due to the absurdly high death tolls and the public backlash to it, the DoD began to phase out the program in March of 1971, and by that year's end had cut it off completely. Over this period, around half of the soldiers, about 180,000, were discharged under conditions less than honorable, sometimes because of missing in duty, going AWOL, talking back to their superiors, or abusing illicit substances. And when these enlistees were let go under this designation, made finding new employment quite difficult, as the majority of employers flat out won't hire veterans with any discharge less than honorable. These veterans were also then denied most of the associated benefits too, leading to many of them becoming homeless. Following the military disaster that was Vietnam, the US Army had to reverse course in the emerging decade. Trying to save face, they had to end the unpopular draft and the even more unpopular war, left to cope with becoming an all-volunteer force. This meant the days of handing readers guns to kill themselves with were over, and the days of investing that money into PR stunts were beginning. In the wake of Vietnam, the Army adopted the slogan, "Be all you can be," to push an appearance of excellence in contrast to the still very recent moron corps. This catchphrase was so successful in drawing in Gen Xers and millennials that the mantra continued to be the Army's slogan up until 2001. Clearly, the appeal to fulfilling potential worked well enough for it to see a resurgence in 2023 among recruiting shortfalls. We'll get more into this at the end, but keep the Army's tendency to fall back on what's worked before in mind. But even more dramatically compelling to the generation's youth was the 1986 movie Top Gun. The doe-eyed youth of the 80s saw Tom Cruise in full military getup and the thrill of flying combat planes as more than enough to fill their hearts with patriotism and an urge to serve. Following its release, the number of applications to become naval aviators reportedly jumped by 500%. Hoping to jump on the trend, recruiters set up tables outside theaters in Los Angeles and Detroit, looking for fresh meat among the moviegoers. Also note that the Army attempted the same trick on Gen Z decades later with the 2022 sequel Top Gun Maverick to far less success. And all of the naval equipment and uniforms in Top Gun came from their partnership with the Department of Defense's Entertainment Media Office, the nearly century-old organization responsible for supplying military resources for the film and entertainment industry. See, just like any copyright or property owner, the American military insists that if you're going to use their uniform's equipment or image, you'll have to receive their permission before doing so. And whenever you need to get signed permission from them to use the military's image, or especially if you're going to use their resources, the Pentagon is going to have a say in how they're depicted in your movie. And if they don't like how they're going to be depicted, they'll pull their support and associated copyright privileges, leaving you with two options. Either you can rework your movie to change the American military to be more ambiguous and scrap any hopes of getting your hands on their ship, or you can cuck out to the government and change your script. For example, take 1996's Independence Day, which the US military originally agreed to supply with costumes, props, and funds and such, but threatened to pull all of their support because of the plot's reliance on Area 51, the alleged black site run by the government, from which many conspiracies have arisen. Given the government's notoriously tight-lipped approach to these theories, the armed forces demanded that the writers scrub all references and mentions to the base from their script, to which they refused and got nothing from the military. And it's moments like these, where rather than providing any commentary of value, I'll instead leave you with a quote that, when taken way out of context, actually lends something to what I'm getting at here.
There's no such thing as an anti-war film.
That quote is from the French director Francis Truffaut, who almost certainly was referring to the psychology of battle's on-screen thrills, and not what I'm using it for. But nevertheless, it becomes increasingly difficult for an American filmmaker to depict an anti-war critique of the government if they have to appease the reputation-obsessed government to depict the military. In 1990, long before the very visible fallout of 9/11, Iraq invaded Kuwait. The following year, the American military was shipped out to quell Iraq, marking the beginning of the two countries' conflict. The battle consisted mainly of aerial bombardments and drone strikes, taking the US and its allies to a decisive victory within 100 hours of launching their on-the-ground campaign. Then the Gulf War broke out, and America's role in it further demonstrated the military's technological ability. The message was clear. Tech was the new guns and muskets. And seeing the writing on the wall, the military shifted the focus of their recruitment efforts to smarter, nerdier guys with the hopes of improving their standing in an increasingly technologically centered battlefield. Only somewhat coincidentally, this intersected perfectly with pop culture of the time, which was dominated by video games, fantasy, and computers. The rise of computers in homes and readily available video game consoles coming onto the market paved the way for the average man being able to sit at home and game rather than having to go to an arcade. And recruiting ads of the era depicted American military members as armored knights, drawing the audience a subconscious parallel between the army men and the medieval heroes that the pop culture and youth were venerating. And many of these advertisements took clear inspiration from the popular D&D and fantasy themes of the time to attract teens with the allure of courageous knights who fought dragons and saved the country. Along with this came the arguably more predatory technique of leaning too much into the fantastical appearance of the service. Much of the campaign deliberately detaches the military from the often negative reality of joining, choosing to cloak those aspects in the magical representation of swag medieval fantasy. In 1996, the U.S. Marine Corps licensed the Doom 2 team to make modifications to their game to create Marine Doom for the purpose of training soldiers. Later along the line, the game simulating a Marine-specific mission was made available for the general public to download and play. And there's a pretty extensive history of the government's involvement with video games. With the leaking of thousands of state documents in 2013 by former NSA contractor Edward Snowden, it was revealed that agencies like the CIA and DoD had been using video games as vehicles for counterterrorism and surveillance operations for years. Fearing that terrorist or criminal networks were using these games to communicate secretly, plan attacks, and move money illegally, the government sent intelligence operatives to craft false identities and try to recruit other informers while snooping in on the data and communications of countless players. In 2008 NSA documents, the agency claimed that through email accounts, IP addresses, and forensic data, terrorist target selectors have been found associated with Xbox Live, Second Life, and World of Warcraft, among other games. In retrospect, these efforts seemingly failed to find any terrorists using these games as a way to commit or plot crimes, and the invasions of privacy didn't appear to yield any successes for counterterrorism. Furthering their hidden presence in video games, the Pentagon's Special Operations Command worked with several foreign media companies to create games that would be downloadable for the public en masse, and then allegedly used these games as vehicles for intelligence agencies to gather information about their users without identifying these games as creations of the Pentagon. Apparently, this phenomenon was so well known that companies saw this existing interest of the government and tried to capitalize on it. In another document released by Snowden, the contracting titan Science Applications International Corporation pushed its potential for, quote, intelligence collection in the game space, and cautioned that these games could be used by ill-intentioned groups to recruit others, suggesting that they could supply, quote, terrorist organizations with a powerful platform to reach core target audiences. There's no definitive information indicating that SAIC received a contract from this, but one ex-employee claimed that at some point, the company had a lucrative agreement with the CIA to monitor the internet for militants. Then in 2002, the US Army released their own first-person shooter game called America's Army, intended to recruit and train soldiers for the battlefield. The idea was conceived by the Army's chief economist to provide the public with an engaging virtual soldier experience, and the best way he felt to do this was through the blossoming video game industry. Upon release, the game was made completely free to play and featured very realistic immersive gameplay. Much of America's army was focused on going into practical medical aid training and has even been credited with saving lives, after a player allegedly used his in-game skills to assist the victims of a horrific car accident. And with all of its good press and impressive graphics, the game became highly decorated in the industry, earning the Computer Gaming World magazine's Editor's Choice Award in 2002, and spinning off numerous sequels that maintain the series' player base to this day. In the words of British-American writer Alistair Cook, Hollywood is, quote, the most effective and disastrous propaganda factory there has ever been in the history of human beings, and the military has used this to its fullest potential. The advertising campaign for 2019's Captain Marvel was more so than any other Marvel movie devoted to cross-promotional marketing with the US military, and especially the Air Force. Marvel's franchise has a long and documented history of using their films and the advertisements for them to show for the military, namely this ad for X-Men First Class, which rather unambiguously merges the marketed presentation of the soldiers with the movie's fictional superheroes. And the cross-promotion for the Captain Marvel movie was no different, with the clear message of this video espousing the similarities between the virtuous qualities of the movie's main character, Carol Danvers, and real-life Air Force pilots. Accompanying this ad, you also have the similarly inspired origin story advertisement, which draws like-minded parallels and is pretty blatantly view-botted for some reason. The National Guard tried similar tactics with 2013's Man of Steel, which clearly included a lot of product placement, with roughly $160 million of the revenue coming from promotions and ads. Among these marketing partners was the National Guard, who launched an ad campaign to accompany the movie's release that included spots that the director Zack Snyder himself filmed with Guard members to paint them as real-life superheroes. And the Guard went all out in investing into this cross-promotion, hosting advanced screenings of Man of Steel in multiplexes and set up themed direct mailers to people to try to recruit them. The campaign also featured NASCAR driver Dale Earnhardt Jr., whose vehicle was painted with a Soldier of Steel theme. But the Guard wasn't done, further releasing large posters, advertising tweets and social media posts, a custom fitness program, and a downloadable game for mobile phones. But the film industry was already dying, and the Army wasn't about to put all of its eggs in one basket. Most of the armed forces created an esports team of active and reserve members who began streaming games on Twitch and chatting with their viewers to recruit new blood. The US Army's esports team was started in November of 2018, and from the very beginning was resented by the rest of the gaming community and plagued by controversy. Part of the team's outreach included links that were dropped into the Army's stream chat and told viewers they could enter a giveaway to win an Xbox Elite Series 2 controller. Upon clicking on this link, however, viewers were not directed to this giveaway, but instead to a recruiting form that lacked any mention of a contest, winners, or the drawing. After the immediate backlash from viewers, fellow streamers, and game developers, Twitch demanded that the Army stop doing these fake giveaways in July 2020. Then the same year, one of the Army's streamers banned a Twitch chatter who asked him what their favorite US military war crime was.
Nice. Really chill guy. Have a nice time getting banned, my dude.
And normally this would just be cringe, typical of overzealous moderation, because after all, Twitch does allow streamers to moderate their channels in whatever way they see fit. However, the Army differs from its fellow streamers in one aspect, since any public forum hosted by the government must follow free speech laws to the letter, a rule established the previous year when a federal court ruled that President Trump wasn't allowed to block his critics on Twitter. Following the ban, the Knight First Amendment Institute raised concerns that the Army's actions violated the First Amendment and asked them to cease. After the incident, the U.S. Army curiously disappeared from Twitch in the face of the controversy, promising that it would return soon, and on August 14th, 2020, it actually did make good on that promise. But when the Army's esports team returned to streaming, it wasn't quite the thunderous fanfare they hoped for, as most of their viewers were coming from the previous controversy and bombarded chat with comments about the Army's questionable past and present. Likely due to this fallout, the Twitch page of the U.S. Army's esports team was shut down about a year later and still remains inactive. In 2019, the U.S. Army released a rap music video titled "Giving All I Got," a 3-minute track featuring 2 soldiers proclaiming the many benefits of Army life. The song was the brainchild of 2 full-time recruiters, Orlando Sutton and James Locke, both sergeants of the first class who produced a similar version on their own. That recording made its way to Major General Frank Muth, the commander in charge of Army recruiting. Impressed by what he saw, Muth requested that they produce an official version with some broader rewrites to focus more on the Army as a whole. However, the song had some notable issues with it. Aside from being extremely fucking cringe, the rappers reference sifting through photos on Flickr.
I'm flipping the script like flipping through pictures on Flickr.
Not Instagram, Flickr. As if anyone under the age of 32 knows what Flickr is. And halfway through the song, they just completely gave up on the subtlety of the message and started listing off things you can get for free in the Army.
Uniform paid for, electric bill paid for, water bill paid for, living quarters paid for.
But among all of these failures, one stood out. See, as the military began to accrue a pretty negative public image, they once again tried to take a more personal approach to recruiting, just like they did back in the 80s. And with the marketing switching towards more of a military is here to serve you attitude, there came 2019's What's Your Warrior campaign. These ads focused on showing off the variety of careers in the armed forces. The What's Your Warrior approach went after a modern hero shooter aesthetic with their flashy graphics and catchy titles for each role in the Army. This drew ire from many on social media that saw the advertisement attempting to attract young people to the service, using somewhat predatory methods by gamifying the look of the military. Now, previously we established that the government, and in particular the Army, has fostered close ties with the video game industry for a long time. And now, in the coming years, this relationship would become even closer and even sneakier. Call of Duty Black Ops, released in 2010, included a mission where players were ordered to murder Fidel Castro, as the American government tried to do. Then, in Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, Ronald Reagan is portrayed as a straight shooter who's willing to bend the rules to serve the free men and women of the world. And in case you need another example, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 shares some striking similarities with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Russian-controlled Iranian-born military officer who was offed by the US in 2020. In the game, the Iranian general character, Gorborani, bears a lot of physical resemblance to Soleimani, and the goal of the game is to murder him. Now, that doesn't mean that the government controls COD, but they did just happen to fly out Coco Francini, an executive producer with close ties to Call of Duty, to their headquarters at Hurlburt Field, Florida in September of 2018. During the visit, the Air Force demonstrated its hardware to make Francini a more credible advocate for the US military. Then they proceeded to show Francini, along with other powerful people in the entertainment sphere, AC-130 planes and CV-22 helicopters, both aircrafts that feature heavily in the Call of Duty franchise. But this is far from the beginning of COD and the Armed Forces relationship. The Marine Corps collaborated with their team in the production of Call of Duty 5 all the way back in 2008, and the company behind Call of Duty, Activision Blizzard, has a history of crossover with the military that stretches back even further. From 2004 to around 2008, Francis Townsend, Activision Blizzard's senior counsel, worked as an associate to President George W. Bush, advising him on homeland security and counterterrorism. Just coincidences here, there's a COD game about counterterrorism. Anyways, in April 2022, the American Friends Service Committee reopened its military recruiter abuse hotline in response to a large uptick in calls of people reporting their alleged experiences of military recruiter misconduct. Within just a year of relaunching the hotline, it received over 100 phone calls, emails, and form submissions of young people with stories of harassment. And by far the largest category of these reports was verbal harassment, including some over social media and via text. In one of these cases, the recruiter called the person old and fat, which, again, probably the tip of the iceberg there. Pretty sure people got called worse. Another recruiter spammed someone with over 70 text messages in a row. In two other instances, recruiters straight up threatened to pull up to someone's house, and in case there was any question, provided proof that they were aware of the person's home address, after they said they were interested in joining. Another avenue that the U.S. Army also went deep into was celebrity endorsements, with them launching an $11 million marketing partnership with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and the United Football League. As part of the agreement, the UFL's players wore uniforms that displayed the Army's logo, and their branding was heavily featured during these games. And Johnson, who owns the United Football League, was supposed to be a brand ambassador for the Army, and got paid to post 5 Instagram stories, each valued at $1 million. Instead of doing that, he uploaded only 2, and projections revealed that 38 enlistments were likely lost under this deal, with the money that they could have redirected elsewhere, but wasted on this deal that got no new recruits. Then the force rebranded and brought back the "Be All You Can Be" slogan from the 80s, hoping to recreate the success of that classic catchphrase off of nostalgia. The ads from this campaign were narrated by actor Jonathan Major of Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, and Creed 3 fame, capitalizing on his star power to try and attract new recruits. His partnership deal quickly crumbled in late March 2023 when he was arrested for physically assaulting his ex-girlfriend, and by the end of the year, Majors was found guilty of 2 misdemeanor counts of assault and harassment. This controversy and his 52-week domestic violence intervention program instantly led to the death of his career in Hollywood and all of his marketing partnerships. So, a lot failed for the Army in the 2020s. This left a need for something different, something crazy. And now, we get into perhaps the strangest example of military recruitment ads. And the reason you probably clicked on the thumbnail. E-girls. On May 19th, 2023, Haley Lujan, also known as @HeyLujan on Instagram, posted her first video on the app, and a few years later, her first TikTok as Lunchbag Lujan. However, Lujan did not share any posts about the US military until May 2022, when she suddenly started sharing videos of herself wearing the Army uniform and describing herself as a psychological operations specialist. Whether this remark was ironic or not is irrelevant because she blew up on TikTok in a big way and has grown to almost 1 million followers since. But she was far from the only attractive girl to cosplay as a member of the military. There is also Israeli influencer Natalie Fadiv, also known as the Gun Waifu. She is one of many such e-girls who post pro-Israel propaganda to sell a very controversial war, and does this through her content, which includes cosplays, sketches, and her story as a member of the IDF. Now, she has a link tree in her bio. Before I click on said link tree to see what other social media she might have, would you like to hazard a guess to what apps this lovely woman posts to? That is literally her ass. Okay, here it is. A f***ing OnlyFans. So, these girls are manipulating gooder men. Obviously. And considering the number of these bitches, they can all be members of the military. Maybe some of them are, but there's no way all of them are. That leaves us with two options of what to believe. Either these girls are cosplaying as service members for clout, which does happen, or governments are paying attractive women to push these messages to lonely men in an overwhelmingly positive light. The simp-to-soldier pipeline is real, and the military stands to benefit heavily from it. So that's the propaganda machine of military recruitment in a nutshell, or at least a summary of its evolution over the last 80 years or so. Just some final thoughts here. First off, the Eagle dilemma is up for grabs. We truly can't prove that they are controlled by the army or the government or anything. But I would guess they're probably involved somehow. But feel free to disagree with me down in the comments. Secondly, I know there's been some discussion floating around about the US standing on the edge of getting into a possible World War III, given the conflicts in Israel, Iran, and Russia-Ukraine heating up. There's a lot of conclusions you can draw from this video, many of them political in nature. I'm not as inclined to get into political shit, because frankly I don't really care. And when it comes to politics, I actually just agree with whatever you think. But if you're going to take away anything from this video, let me tell you something to take away. The American military is struggling. I said as much in the intro. Recruiting numbers consistently fall short, and plenty of the recruits they do manage to draw in leave within the first 6 months. To combat this, some far-out things have been tried, and now the military is mostly falling back on nostalgic things, simply because they've worked before in the past. Listen, a lot of people don't like the military, or the government for that matter, for a variety of reasons, some of which are perfectly valid. But if you want to join the military, don't let those reasons stop you. Ultimately, if you're aware of everything going on with the armed forces and still want to enlist, who cares? In the wise words of one Twitter user, young men, please don't fall for the military psyop because of breasts. Don't go there because you were sucked into a lie. Go there because you want to commit war crimes. Until next time, Godspeed, bitches.